Thank you so much for the introduction, Matloob, and for the invitation to present. The work that I'm presenting today is work in progress. So I'll talk about bits that are finished and some early evidence on things that we are still working on. As Matloob said, this is on wage subsidies in Pakistan. It's joint work with Maurizio Bussolo, Jean Lee, Nayantara Sarma, and Anaise Williams, all at the bank. This project is motivated by the gap in female labor force participation and male labor force participation rates in South Asia. So this is a really nice illustration of the gap that exists in South Asia. So the yellow one is the gap that you can see. You can also see that over the years, this gap between male and female labor force participation rates hasn't actually narrowed in the region. The average is around 25% in South Asia for women, while about 80% of the men are participating in the labor force. The only other region that's equally bad is the MENA region, but we are today focusing on South Asia, and within it, on a country that has probably one of the lowest female labor force participation rates in the world. So Pakistan's FLFP is around 22%. Some estimates say it's 25%, but roughly in that range, but also one of the lowest in the world regardless. There's been quite a lot of work that has been done to understand the reasons for this low labor force participation rate of women in Pakistan and more broadly in the developing world. There's a lot of work that has focused on supply side constraints. These relate to concerns about safe transport, also about social norms that dictate that women shouldn't be out of the household, working or interacting with the other gender, and then also overall household dynamics about who's going to take care of the children, who's going to do the housework, that impede female labor force participation. So we understand quite well by now on what really constrains women from participating in the labor force. But we know less about what are the firm side constraints to female hiring. Because there are women who may want to be on the job market, who may also face constraints from the other side, from the firm side, because of the norms in these countries on hiring women. And other constraints might actually just have to do with, the investments that they have to make in order to hire women. So this study is attempting to generate experimental evidence on whether a demand-side labor market intervention can actually increase female hiring and retention. So this is a study that very much tries to tackle this question by doing an intervention and looking at the evidence to understand if alleviating some of, in some sense, the monetary constraint can actually boost women being hired by firms in Pakistan. And to do this, we work with one of the largest online job search platforms in Pakistan. It's called rosie.pk. It has over 100,000 firms and 5 million job seekers. And I'll tell you more about how we actually execute this study. But in terms of the research questions that we want to answer, we want to first understand what is the impact of a temporary wage subsidy on female hiring. So this is a subsidy to the firm, not to the worker. We were, and I'm going to put this in gray because we were initially also interested in understanding how this temporary wage subsidy then impacts the retention of women who might be employed as a result and on future hiring and attitudes of hiring managers. This is something that I'll not be able to provide you evidence on because we had really terrible follow-up rates. We couldn't really survey a lot of the firms in the longer run. But instead of that, what I will provide you is some early evidence on actually analyzing the advertisements by these very same firms on the Rosie portal and whether the stated gender preference on these changed as a result of the intervention. So we'll be able to provide you some longer term evidence, but this doesn't directly come from the firms, unfortunately. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the main findings in case you have to drop off. So we worked with about 1,200 firms which had an open job position on the rosie.pk portal with no stated gender preference. So if they had already stated that they want to hire a man or a woman, we exclude these firms for obvious reasons. And we actually made the subsidy offer, which is one of the contributions of this study, via the Becker-DeGroot-Marshak mechanism to essentially get the firms to reveal the true level of subsidy that they would really require. And we actually find that the average subsidy is not very high. It's about 15% is what the hiring managers reveal to us is the level of subsidy that they would require to hire women. And reassuringly, this revealed subsidy level is actually correlated with things that we would expect it to be correlated with. So lower subsidy bids are correlated with less conservative perception of societal norms about women's work. And also already if the firm had separated toilets by gender. So these firms would, it appears, already made investments in having female employees, and managers who were less concerned or who perceived norms about women's work as less regressive were not asking for a very high subsidy. While on the other end, managers who didn't already have separated toilets, for example, or had more conservative views of societal norms were asking for higher subsidies in line with how we would expect these to play out.
Two quick questions, Mahreen. Sorry. One is the skills required for these jobs is kind of different types of skills. So these are, not necessarily any particular skill level. The 1,200 jobs that or 1,200 pounds.
So yes. So that is why we started out with no stated gender preference. So if it is the kind of job that requires men have a comparative advantage, then they would probably have already stated men on the job advertisement. But otherwise, within the pool of firms that we are looking at, yes, it's a range of kind of skills that they would require. I'll show you the firm characteristics in a bit, but I think the one major cluster that we have are IT firms. So a lot of these are maybe call centers, those kinds of jobs that are part of it. But yes, we will have heterogeneity in skills.
Because the other thing, one of the other things in Pakistan, for instance, or maybe other countries as well, is the type of jobs women are willing to do. I mean, it's probably true everywhere, but it's kind of more restrictive in terms of, it's not necessarily kind of the demand side, but also in terms of what type of jobs they're willing to do. And so the subsidy may not have, I mean, I'm sure you'll talk about it in a...
So it could be that, like, even if we give the subsidies, so in that sense, I think the firms would have a sense of this, that no matter how much you subsidize us, we can't find a skilled woman to actually do the job. And so I think that would reflect in the subsidy that they're asking us for. We interpret no stated gender preference as revealing that it is possible for women to do these jobs. And we have some information on applications as well that I can show you later, that indeed women were applying for these jobs. And so it doesn't look like a case of that women were not applying at all. And so we think we have a pool of jobs where women are probably okay working in these firms.
I just have a quick question to follow-up question. So they're all in private sector, right? There are no public sector firms?
No. These are all private sector firms. That's correct. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So what we find is that the wage subsidy offer leads to an 11 percentage points increase in the likelihood of a female being hired. And what is very interesting is that these effects are particularly large for firms that only had male employees at baseline. So these effects so the subsidy seems to have really mattered for that kind of profile of firms. So in terms of our contribution to literature, as I've said already...
Mahreen, may I also ask a question regarding age? Is that hiring the wage subsidy goes to hiring a woman of any age, or is there a restriction by the scheme?
So as long as they hire a woman, no matter what age she is, we'll give them a subsidy. There were no constraints on who to hire other than gender.
Okay, thanks. Because this, I think, would make a lot of a difference.
Would make a lot of, sorry?
Of difference. I mean, if they were prepared to hire a woman who wasn't still in childbearing age or not.
I see. We just said that as long as if you find a woman that has the skill level that you require to do the job, what is the subsidy? I'll tell you the exact question that we asked. We didn't ask, for different ages, what would be the subsidy? But that's an interesting point. Absolutely. It may be that they require a different subsidy level. But then we also have to think about that if women are no longer in the childbearing age, then they also have a lot of experience, and it's hard to separate out those two.
Yes. That is true.
So that's tricky, but still interesting, of course.
Thanks.
So in terms of our contribution to the literature, so most research, as I was saying earlier, has focused on targeting the supply side influences of norms on female employment. But we do know that wage subsidies have a long history of broader use within the developed world. They have actually been used. There's one other study that in Jordan where it was used to boost female employment in the short run. But these were subsidies that were offered directly to women to encourage them to join the labor market and to help them overcome some of the challenges they may face going on the market from being offered lower wages or more, hefty transport costs that they may face. So our contribution is that we study the impact on the firm level and evaluate the potential to use a partial subsidy to boost female employment. So we're not entirely subsidizing them. We're trying to get them to reveal the real level of subsidy they would require and then see if that leads to more women being hired. So given that this is, a broad audience, let me just tell you about Rosie.pk, our partner organization that we are working with. This was founded in 2007. And it is the leading job search online portal in Pakistan. A set of co-authors actually compared the Rosie database comprised of 5 million job seekers and over 100,000 registered employers with the nationwide labor force and enterprise surveys in Pakistan. And they do find that the firms on Rosie.pk tend to be smaller, younger firms concentrated in the ICT sector, as you would expect, right? Like if they are going ahead from a developing country and posting a job online, they have to be a certain profile. So we want to be clear that we're not working with a representative sample of firms in the country. We are working with the more younger dynamic firms. And a large majority of them are based in the 3 main cities of the country and tend to offer a higher salary than, a representative sample of firms in the country. But in terms of our experiment, we are only considering firms within Rosie.pk. So internally, our estimates are valid. And in terms of the job seekers, it's interesting that only 50% of them are from the 3 main cities. So in that sense, we are getting job seekers from all over the country. But these tend to be younger and more educated. But the proportion of women on this job search portal is consistent with the overall labor market. Again, this is expected because you need to be educated at a certain level to use an online job search portal and probably younger to have the IT skills. So this is just to provide you a bit of context in terms of external validity if you're interested. So this is a randomized control trial, and we are working with over a time period with firms that had a job posting on Rosie.pk, and we had the entire sampling frame essentially. A sample frame is essentially the entire universe of firms that met the criteria of having a job advertisement that had no gender on it, already specified, and an upper limit of 100,000 Pakistani rupee per month in salary due to budgetary constraints, because our subsidy was as a proportion of the higher salary band that they had specified in the job advertisement. So of course we couldn't subsidize very, very high end jobs. And to be honest, that was also not the target of our study. So in terms of recruiting the sample for our study, we contacted everyone in the sample frame to conduct a baseline survey. That's essentially 7,500 firms that we reached out to with an with a job advertisement that was open. And we did not contact firms again and again. So if, for example, during our sampling period, a firm then posted another job, we wouldn't contact them. We just only have one firm for one job advert in our sample. We were able to get to about 1,355 of the firms who completed a baseline survey with us. It's about 17% of the overall firms that we contacted. This is expected. Firms surveys are notoriously hard to do, especially on the phone. And we end up with a total sample of 1,227 firms. We lose out some firms because by the time we did the baseline survey with them, they'd already hired. So if they'd already hired, we didn't really include them in our sample because there's no point in doing an intervention with them. So the results that I'm going to show you today are for 1,227 firms that had a job advertisement, and we were able to conduct successfully a baseline survey with them before they actually hired anybody. This was happening on an ongoing basis, so we used a min-max t-stat re-randomization procedure to essentially split the sample of firms into treatment and control. We did stratify on a range of characteristics. This was important to us to do some heterogeneity, including the one on the sex ratio in the firm that I talked about earlier. And because fresh vacancies are posted continuously, the firms were randomized every week, but our overall sample is balanced. This was to make sure that happened. So the intervention, it's very straightforward. It's a single treatment arm. So in that sense, the RCT design is straightforward. What was the most challenging bit was actually recruiting the sample of firms. So the single treatment arm consisted of the potential to win a 6-month wage subsidy to be paid monthly if a woman is hired for the position. As I said earlier, we used the BDM to elicit truthful reporting of the level of subsidy the firms would need to hire a female candidate. The reason we did BDM was that we were actually interested in learning something about, if you were to use it as a policy, just how much subsidy do you need to give? We could, of course, give 100% subsidy to a small set of firms, but that's not feasible to do in reality. So we wanted to be able to get them to truthfully report just how much do they need in terms of a subsidy. So we told them, imagine you were...
Is there a restriction on whether they shouldn't have fired someone at the same time? Say they fire another woman or they fire a man to hire this
We
woman.
can't. Unfortunately, there's no way for us to verify that, right? Like employment records and all of these, nearly all of them are still informal firms. So yeah, we can't do that. So if you're imagining a situation in which because we're giving them a subsidy, but it is for that job opening, right? We were concerned. So what we were concerned about is that they lied to us, right? So we did have a lot of audits in place with surprise checks, and we wanted, actual contracts and phone number of the woman hired. So we tried our best to do as many checks as possible eventually. But at this stage, this is really about trying to get them truthfully reveal the subsidy that would be required. That comes later when the hiring has actually happened and we're actually paying the subsidy. The subsidy is paid after they've actually hired. So in some sense, what we're trying to understand has already happened, if that makes sense. Like in terms of what we're trying to estimate has already happened.
Okay.
But the other thing is also, I mean, you said these are younger firms and kind of more employing younger people as well. They might have hired the woman anyway. I mean, how do you know?
Absolutely, yeah. So so you would see eventually what the rates are, and yeah, absolutely, it could be. And in that sense, they could actually tell us that we don't really need a subsidy to hire a woman. We're asking about the minimum subsidy.
But right, if you are getting a subsidy, then why would you say I don't need a subsidy? I mean, you could be hiring and then get the extra money. Yeah.
Of course. So you can interpret the low rates that we are getting as that maybe they didn't need a subsidy. But there is variation in the amounts that they told us, and those variations make sense in terms of the profile of firms that we would expect. So we're not saying each and every firm needs a subsidy, but we're saying that there is variation. There are some firms who are clearly need a subsidy in order to start hiring women in their firms. As I was saying earlier, that the male-only firms, there are, as you will see when I show you the firm characteristics, there are 20% of our sample actually has no women. And at that time, they didn't know why we were doing the subsidy. This is like baseline information, right? And so it isn't that every firm has a woman already.
And from the text, it doesn't. Did they know that you would actually be giving them the subsidy? Because to me, if I'm reading this, I don't know if you were going to give it to me. It's just a question.
No, absolutely. They knew.
Oh, they knew already when you asked that question.
Okay. So at the time of the intervention, we told them clearly that this is real. We also did an unincentivized version at baseline that I'll also tell you about. So that was just to understand that when you incentivize this versus when it's unincentivized, what happens? And that might answer.
I understand that they knew when the intervention was happening, but when you were soliciting the level of the subsidy, did they know that was going to be real, or was that just part of the survey before they knew you could actually offer them the money?
No, they knew. So at the time of the intervention, they knew. We only did the intervention with those who were randomized into the treatment group. Nobody. Yeah, there are no surveys at the intervention stage with the control group.
Mm.
And so we're saying, imagine you were offered a wage subsidy, that is a share of the employee's salary would be paid by us for 6 months. What is the lowest subsidy percentage you would be willing to accept to hire a qualified female candidate for this position? And they were told that if the desired subsidy amount is higher than the random draw, we cannot pay any share of the hired female's employee's salary. This is to dissuade them from giving us a very, very high number. And they do a practice round using an unrelated scenario that's unincentivized to make sure they understand how BDM works. And then we told them this is real. If then the random, number comes out lower, then you will actually get the actual subsidy. So this is just to make sure that they think of it as something real. And so the hiring manager provides a number that represents the percentage of salary that would need to be subsidized to hire a woman. And this is the incentivized. This is real. And the position wins if the incentivized subsidy is less than or equal to the computer-generated random number. And the manager is informed immediately of the outcome. So they know immediately whether they've won a subsidy or not. And so
Mahreen,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just a curiosity, do you have information on the type of position that they are advertising, whether it's a temporary or is a permanent?
So we have some information, but it's usually nearly all of them are contracts. They're not going to be permanent jobs forever.
So
it's
1
very,
year,
very
like
rare.
a 1 year position.
Exactly. Yeah, and then they sort of keep renewing them. Yeah. So that's an important question to keep in mind, that like these are not like really permanent, very high skilled kind of jobs that we are working with. Okay, so I'm going to very briefly sketch out why we think that this subsidy is something that's worth studying. So if we just take the very basic labor market model, we assume that workers are paid their marginal product. However, if women are actually less productive or are perceived to be less productive, they would be hired but paid lower wages. And in reality, when there are hiring frictions, especially as in the case of Pakistan, where the female labor force participation rates are so low, and there's hence uncertainty about how productive women are, I think somebody had brought up a childbearing age, like, family commitments has implications for productivity of women. You'll often hear hiring managers complain about women having to leave at a certain time. This would then mean that women are then actually being paid lower than what they should be. And in that sense, a temporary wage subsidy could lead to an increase in female employment in the short run. And this could then also lead to longer term employments if firms if this helps a firm learn about the quality of female workers and they actually learn on the job, increase their productivity, or if these subsidies are actually helping firms make these fixed cost investments, as I was mentioning earlier, like gender separated toilets or other facilities for women that allow them to hire women in the future as well. So that is the rationale for doing this subsidy.
Can I ask a quick question on this? So when you were motivating it at first, you were talking nothing about change, like different productivity, but more about the social norms of hiring women and the, infrastructure being set up. But the McKinsey stuff here is about productivity. So which one? I mean, I'm not sure if you can separate that, right? But do the firms really think that women are going to do a lower marginal product per hour, or do they just feel like, well, women shouldn't be working, so we don't really want to hire them?
Yeah, so I think so there are a couple of things right here. We can't unpack it, unfortunately. So that's why we're saying, it could be all of these, but which is why it's important to see if this has an effect or not. And how does this correlate with how the hiring manager perceives societal norms to be? There's also this distinction, and I'll talk about this I think in the data descriptives, about what you feel and what you think society feels. And so that is also important. Like, does the hiring manager believe that women shouldn't be hired, or are they worried that, in society, it's not like that women work. And so that will have a negative effect on other workers in the firm. Unfortunately, we can't unpack all of this. We try to ask a lot of questions at baseline just to document what these look like, because we know almost nothing about firm side perceptions of women working. And I'm going to focus on the key results of the RCT here, but we do have a lot of rich data, probably for the first time, on how managers perceive, like whether, they think that women should be working, what impacts do they have if that manager has worked with a woman before, on team dynamics and so on. So there are layers and layers of it. It's like norms within the firm, norms in the society, about women working overall, like working, but also what implications there are of a woman being hired in a firm, and how that changes dynamics of teams, for example. So I agree with you that the McKinsey framework doesn't talk directly about norms, but in as much as like these norms then have an effect on how productive women can be, then it's relevant, because it could, right? If the gender dynamics, as I said, are such that the men are not willing to work with women very well, then productivity could as a result be lower, as well as there may be concerns that overall productivity of teams go down. So in terms of the timeline, all the surveys, I think I've mentioned this before, for the study were administered on the phone with the hiring manager. Part of this was also because we were just like in the post-COVID period, but partly also because it's so hard to go around cities, like actually surveying firms. So the baseline happened over almost a 6-month period between April and November 2022. As I said earlier, we managed to do a survey about 1227 firms. So the baseline survey was with everybody. Then we only contacted firms who were randomized to be in the treatment group, and successfully did an intervention with 547 of them. I think there was about a slightly more I'll talk about, I think it's on the next slide, that we couldn't reach, but we run an ITT regardless. And then we went back to the full set of 1227 firms and tried to do a hiring follow-up survey with them, all of them. We reached about 1,044 of the firms. And the results that I'm going to show you today are from this hiring follow-up. As I said earlier, we also attempted earlier this year a longer-term follow-up with the firms, but unfortunately, we only reached 25% of the firms. We tried a lot, like web forms and calling them and, many, many things, but it's just almost impossible to get them to engage with us over the longer term. And that's something to reflect on and think about also for us, as well as others, in terms of thinking about how do you get them in the longer run to still respond to surveys. I think there have been a few questions about firm characteristics. So let me just show you in terms of our sample of firms. We have about 100, the average firm has about 100 employees. So these are not really tiny, not like micro entrepreneurs. These are like firms. That's why they're on the ROSI portal. And about 20% of them are male-only firms. 93% are from the main city. I think in terms of the biggest group of firms that we have are IT firms. About 78% of them already had separated toilets by gender. This probably just correlates with this male-only firm. And about 16% of them even had childcare services. So it's not like, as going back to Matloob's point, like some of them might have just hired women regardless of our subsidy. But it's very hard for us to predict, at the time the baseline, only those firms who wouldn't have hired and do a intervention with them. One model could be just to do it with male-only firms, but that would require a huge, huge effort to get to a powered sample size. In terms of the job characteristics, this is the range, like the average salary at that back in 2022 was about 59,000 rupees per month. About 70% of them did require an undergraduate degree. There was about half of them even had transportation or some allowance, etc. So these jobs have a profile where it's not impossible for women to be hired, is how we interpret this. The sample is well balanced by treatment and control group on firm and job characteristics. So we're happy with the experimental integrity. So let me just take a minute to talk about how does our sample of firm compare to other firms that are on rosi.pk. I'd already talked about how rosi.pk firms compare to firms in general.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Can I please ask a question on the jobs characteristics, your slide before? You don't have any information on the duration of the position or the contract offered, because that makes a big difference. If they are going to hire them all after the 6 months, the effect is not very major.
It's very hard to get that information in Pakistan. That's not something that they will reveal to you initially. So one of the challenges that we faced is that in order to disperse the subsidy, we were like, we need to see the contract. And actually, a lot of them don't even do contracts.
No, but when they advertise the position online,
they don't say
mention the duration for the position.
No, it's a temp. No, so a lot of times it's through negotiation as you go along. So you have to imagine these are informal firms. It's a slightly different context from a formalized developed country labor market. Yeah, but I totally take your point. I agree with you completely on what you're saying. And that was one thing that we were concerned with, that maybe they'll just hire them because of the subsidy and fire them immediately afterwards, which is why we were trying to do a longer term follow-up. But unfortunately, it was really, really hard to go back. So our way of...
Yeah, just another follow-up question. I understand. You didn't have any follow-up discussion with the women hired?
So we did have a very small... So I think one of the issues was that there is a bit of an IRB issue with getting firms to give you contact details of the people that they've hired. And that was a bit tricky. And they got really, they were very worried about us wanting to talk with their employees. So getting control firms to also give us information about people that they've hired is not easy. We did I think, I don't remember off the top of my head, we managed to reach a very small sample of them. But not to a size where I can tell you something, meaningful.
Thanks.
Okay, I just have a quick question. When I look at that, can we go back to that slide, the one you? So I would suspect there should be a very high correlation between the last two variables, like flexible working hours, and working from home. So do you have any sense how highly they are correlated?
Yeah, they are probably, yeah. So I think they're slightly different. I think one of them is like, can you choose the work hours so it's about like, think about call centers. I can do a night shift, but I still have to come there. The other one is more about whether that you still have to work 9 to 5, but you can work from home. So they are correlated, but these are just to give you a sense of the kind of characteristics.
I mean, I'll just...
But they're balanced across treatment and control.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to, go on and show that I was going to talk about the sample characteristics as compared to the overall firms that advertise on rosie.pk. So less than 30% of the total firms that post vacancies do report explicit gender preferences for candidates. But we have to remember that in another study, which was not based off of an online job search portal, another study actually found that 70% of the employers have no female employees and have no interest in hiring. So this is just to highlight that rosie.pk firms are slightly different from average firms in the country. But in terms of our firms and how they are different from the job advertisements on the same portal, we actually find no effect. So it doesn't look like we've gotten a selected sample of rosie.pk firms, at least. The main difference is the maximum salary, and that was a budgetary constraint. So we're quite happy that we're representative of rosie.pk firms, but as I've said earlier, we may not be representative of firms in general in Pakistan. So the one thing that I wanted to mention is that we did measure own and perception of societal norms. So we did a kind of like a vignette and asked about whether they think it's okay for a woman to work and whether they think the society thinks it's okay for a woman to work or not. We also ask questions about whether men are comfortable working with women, as I was mentioning earlier, whether they're a distraction, if women have lower productivity, and we then construct a standardized index of managers' own norms and perception of societal norms using these questions that we asked everybody at baseline. I would just mention here, nobody has brought it up, but it was interesting to me that 15% of the sample are actually female managers. And they actually have significantly less conservative personal norms, but much worse perception of societal norms as compared to male managers. This doesn't have anything to do with the RCT, but I thought this is a really interesting, insight on, maybe women who are working, they realize a lot more than male managers about how difficult it is and how the society perceives them. And the higher the share of female employees in the firm, the lower the manager's perception of society's disapproval of women's work, which makes sense. So this is some of these correlations we check just to make sure that the data that we collected is meaningful. So as I mentioned earlier, the intervention was conducted with 547 out of the 657 firms in the treatment group. It's 83% simply, again, because we couldn't reach firms. And this was after many repeated attempts. And nearly 80% of the firms actually offered the treatment won a wage subsidy. So the random draw ensured, they actually won it. And the average subsidy, as I mentioned before, is about 15%. At baseline, we actually asked the entire sample, so both the treatment and the control group, in an unincentivized setting, what would be the subsidy amount that they would need. So we asked this at the end of the baseline survey, and the average unincentivized amount was actually higher. It was about 26%. So managers did understand that it was incentivized, and this is to illustrate that if we'd not done it in an incentivized way, they were actually asking for a lot more money when there was nothing at stake. But still, it was not credible. It's not that they were saying we need 100% subsidy. So we clearly have a set of firms that would require some support to hire women, but it's not like even in an unincentivized setting, they would, that they see women productivity to be so much lower, or the investments that they need to make to be so high that they need a very large subsidy amount. And it's also interesting that there is actually a 0.334 significant correlation between the incentivized and unincentivized subsidy amounts. It's just that I think in the unincentivized version, some firms managers just went wild and gave very high answers. But in general, roughly, they do correlate. It's just that the incentivized version is the distribution is to the left, as you would expect. Once it was, something was at stake, we perceive this as them giving what is really the minimum that they would need, rather than just trying to get some money off, as much money as they could. Okay, so we also did some lasso regression analysis on this. Mm-hmm.
Can I ask you a quick question? So when you look at that subsidy, can a firm really inflate their wage bill or whatever, saying that we are offering high salaries, and then try to collect high subsidy?
No, so we told them that the subsidy will be, the maximum subsidy we will pay is on the salary that they stated on the job advertisement.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, can you advertise one rate and pay a different salary, so that you do get the subsidy from the state?
I'm a bit confused.
No, because what I was confused is, when you talk about the subsidy, whatever 15%, 20%, it is, let's suppose it's a fraction of the wage bill, right? Whatever the wages you're offering to a particular, let's suppose it's 100,000 rupees. I don't know if it is 100,000 rupees, so 15% is about 15,000 rupees, right? Not that they're paying. What I'm saying is, can they advertise a high salary, but when the negotiations go through, could they pay a lower salary?
Yeah, they could. So it's a band, right? So we said we will not pay you more than the maximum salary that you've stated. It's 15% of the actual salary that they agree with the employee.
Yeah, my concern is how it is going to be enforced, because you can advertise, you can say,
sure, yeah. So how it's going to be enforced is something that requires audits, which is what I was mentioning earlier.
That is
absolutely
thing, right?
It's not easy, yeah. So we require them to give us contracts, some written proof, a bank, because the details of them actually paying that salary. So that's something that the team, that partner firm that was actually implementing the study, had to work around. And because this was a World Bank project, they were worried about, of course, also that they don't want leakage. Absolutely, that's an implementation concern. Having said that, that's something that is a concern later on. I think in terms of our understanding of what subsidy levels and so on, that is not threatened by that. But that implementation concern in terms of scaling this up, for example, is absolutely valid. Okay, so very quickly, we did do some regression analysis to just understand what these incentivized subsidy amounts are. So just to understand, what is making some managers say a high amount versus a low amount. And what we do see is, as I mentioned before, I think as well in the main findings, that the correlates of lower subsidy amounts are required by the manager to hire a female are the availability of separate toilets in the office and the manager having a less conservative perception of societal norms. So those managers were less likely to ask for a high subsidy. And the other end of the spectrum, they were asking for higher subsidies. So I'm just going to show you now the main set of results that we have. It's a very straightforward estimating equation where we have our intent to treat dummy for any firm that was randomized into the treatment group. This study is pre-registered and the analysis does follow a pre-analysis plan. And what data that I'm using is on the hiring follow-up survey, which was conducted with 1,044 firms. We do have 15% attrition, which is actually great for a phone survey. We're actually really proud of managing to reach this many firms. But one problem that we do have is that we have some differential attrition across the two groups by about 4 percentage points. And so I am going to show you Lee bounds to adjust for that. And the outcome of interest is very, very straightforward. This is an indicator variable for if a female is higher for the position and 0 otherwise. So what you're seeing here are in the first column are the simplest set of results. These are for the 1,044 firms for whom we have the hiring follow-up survey. So for the job that we essentially did the baseline with, who was hired, whether it was a male or a female, and we don't have any controls here, and there was a 10 percentage points increase in the likely, about 11 percentage actually points higher likelihood of women being hired. Once we introduce controls, PDS lasso selected controls, the results are robust. The results are also robust to doing Lee bounds that basically just for differential attrition. What's interesting to note here, and which was surprising for us, was that actually 44% of the control firms had also hired a woman. So back to Matloob's question of like, maybe these firms would have hired women regardless of whether they were being given a subsidy or not. And this came as a surprise to us because initially when we looked at the number of job applicants in the job search portal, they're consistent with overall rates of female labor force participation. And so we were a bit surprised when we saw this because Rosie.pk, they don't know actually who's hired. So there's no data that exists on who's actually being hired through the portal. So this is like the first data that we had. And so then we got a bit concerned. We were like, okay, maybe the control group is telling us that they're more likely that they're hiring women just because they know they might have heard that, we are giving subsidies, or like because we've asked them so many questions about women participating in the labor force. And so this is some sort of experimenter demand effect. And these are not actually women being hired. So what we then did was that we did a survey with out of sample firms. So after our study had ended, we got Rosie to give us a set of job advertisements earlier this year. And we then did a survey with a randomly selected of job ads without applying any criteria to get an estimate of the rate of female hiring on non-study firms. And we actually see somewhat consistent rates of female hiring in non-sample firms, which had never been approached before, of about 38%. So it does seem like the rates are slightly higher, higher rates of female hiring in firms that are on Rosie.pk, and those who do not put out a job advertisement with a gender preference. So this is worth bearing in mind in terms of when we're thinking about the sample. So we don't think that our control group was lying. It's just that it appears that the rates of female hiring are higher than what we would expect in a general sample of firms in the country. As I said earlier, we also have some information on applications that went through the Rosie portal. So we don't know the full universe of people who applied for these jobs because they could have applied directly to the firms as well. And we don't have data on that, but we do have data from the Rosie portal on the gender of the applicants. And we actually see that 18% of the applicants are women, and the average number of male applicants is 42, and the average number of female applicants is 10. And then we have data on the gender of candidates interviewed from about 574 firms. This is something that we asked later. And the proportion of female applicants is about 19%. So again, consistent with what we're seeing in the portal data, but those who were interviewed are much higher. They're about 41%, even in the control group, are telling us that they've actually interviewed a female for these jobs. And the ratio of female candidates to the total number of candidates interviewed is about 2.5 percentage points higher in the treatment group, but this is not statistically significantly different between the two groups. Because one mechanism you can think of is that, because they had offered a subsidy, maybe they were just interviewing a lot of women, trying to search for a qualified woman. We're not seeing very clear evidence of that, but we're definitely seeing that these pool of firms are very actively actually interviewing women, which we think, again, is something of an interesting insight. Finally, I want to show you some heterogeneity. We've done a lot of heterogeneity in the one, along the pre-specified characteristics that we also stratified on. And the one interesting one that pops up is firms that were male only. And a large part of our treatment effect is actually coming from those firms. And I would also like to mention here that the male only firms had asked for a higher subsidy level because clearly these are firms that had not hired women before. And so their minimum subsidy was higher, but they seem to have a huge effect. So 27% of the control group had also hired a woman, but there's a 24 percentage point. So like literally there's a huge jump in female hiring in male only firms. The effect is still significant in the mixed gender firms, but it is much smaller when you break it apart. And again, in terms of these effects, these are Lee bounds. They go through especially for the male firms. So a lot of our treatment effects are actually driven by these male-only firms responding to the subsidy offer and hiring women. It would have been really super interesting to see what this does to future hiring and retention. Unfortunately, we don't have information on that. We also do a treatment on treated estimation because remember, not all firms were treated. We have a very, very strong first stage, which is what I'm showing you here. And then when we use that for the second stage, we again, the firms that had one, there is even a higher effect of about 18 percentage points, again, much higher for male-only firms than for mixed-gender firms. So it indeed seems to be flowing through the subsidy, them actually winning the subsidy, which is what's driving these results. And then finally, this is something that we've really just started to work on. But I'm going to show you some early evidence. So we now have ROSI portal data because our endline was such a struggle on all job advertisements by our sample firms between January 2020 and until May 2024. So 2 years after the intervention, we're seeing what the job advertisements look like for the same sample of firms over time. So we have about 26,000 observations, which are job ads from 1144 firms. So we don't have the complete, we're missing about 60 or 70 firms, which have devolved or like merged or something. That's what Rosie told us. But we have a bulk of our sample firms. And what we want to see is if being treated led to an impact on the stated gender preference from their future ads. We just want to see what it does to future decisions by the firm. And so what we do is we estimate an ITT again here, where we're interacting the subsidy assignment, so being in the treatment group, to a post, which is like if you post the baseline survey, we're taking that as the time, and the baseline and intervention were literally a week apart. So you can think of that as that date. Intervention was also obviously only with the treatment group. So we're using the baseline date. And so we're doing an interaction between subsidy assignment and post. And we also add fixed effects for year and month of posting. And we have a very simple result right now, which is that job advertisements with stated male preference reduces by about 5 percentage points in the treated firms after the intervention. So we're seeing some sign that they're less likely to post jobs with the male state preference, clear male preference after treatment. And in that post period for the treatment groups. We haven't yet analyzed whether this is driven by the male-only firms. That would be interesting to do. It's worth mentioning here that on female preference jobs or on mixed gender preference jobs, we don't see any effects. It's only when there's a stated male preference job where we're seeing treatment effects even 2 years out. So I'm just going to conclude and then we can have some discussion. So we show the potential for the subsidy offers to boost female employment, at least in the short run. There's about 11 percentage points increase, and this is particularly large for firms that did not have any female employees at baseline. And we use the BDM mechanism to show that the average subsidy required is actually not very large, and that this is correlated with existing facilities from hiring women. Thank you.
Very good timing. Perfect. Thanks, Maureen. Any questions?
I just have one question. Yeah. When you showed your regression results, those are like a linear probability model. I mean, you could have estimated a probit or a logit, right? Can you hear me?
I think Maureen's Wi-Fi might be playing up a bit, it seems. Yeah, I think we've lost her for a while. Let's see if
Is she back?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened. I dropped off.
I think your Wi-Fi
maybe
was
he don't
kind
want
of
to take my question. I'm just kidding. No, when you showed your regression results, I was just wondering because I have to go run to go teach. But anyway, so when you showed your regression results, you could have ran a probit or a logit, right? Because what you showed was just like a linear probability model, because your outcome variable is whether a female was hired, and then you have all the controls on the right hand side.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm just curious why. I mean, you get much more efficient results if you're able to do it with. I mean, because
yeah, I think it's like in the simplest form, you can also just do a mean difference and a t-test in an RCT setting. Like, it's just like, what is the rate in the control group, what's the rate in the treatment group, and the difference between the two.
I mean, I would suggest,
if you're experimental,
I would recommend, and if you at the margin, if you can do it, that'll be wonderful. Sure. Thanks so much for your. So, folks, I got to run back because I have to head back to the campus. All the best.
Any other questions?
So I just on the longer term, when you said the share of firms that are not posting a gender preference, is it for future jobs? That's like when you were interviewing at the follow-up?
So we have, so this is not from our interviews, this is from the portal data. So because I said our long run surveys were not successful because we couldn't, so we're taking so this is in the future. So we have data for 2 years after our intervention and 2 years before on all job advertisements by firms in our sample, and we're analyzing those.
Okay, anything else? While people are thinking, this is more like a general thing, right? So you started, so this is going back to kind of social norms and McKinsey kind of productivity kind of story. And it's not necessarily that you have to answer this thing in the context of your paper, but I was just wondering how much, I know incentives matter, but when there are social norms at play, generally people kind of, subsidy would not have necessarily changed people's mind. So in that sense, and especially your research kind of shows male-only firms were affected considerably. So it might have been more kind of productivity story in the sense that, the male-only were thinking, and this goes probably to the other question about childbearing and all those things, that there's a productivity issue. And so suddenly now, if I'm being subsidized, then it might address some of the productivity issues. I mean, that, just kind of, I know you can't show it obviously, but
I think that's a fair point. Like, I think it's almost impossible, as we were discussing earlier, to disentangle the two. This does indicate the fact that they're responding to the subsidy indicates that the social norms are not entirely binding. They don't perceive those to be the binding constraint. We think it's probably a combination of concerns about social norms, but also lower productivity, and also having to make the investments that they need to hire a woman. And so there will be, at the margin, there will be firms who, no matter how much subsidy you offer them, they're not going to budge. But there seems like there are a set of firms where it is possible to nudge them into hiring women. And it seems like over time that also then means that they're less likely to put out advertisements that they want a man. And that's we think that's promising. We're definitely not going to manage to change each and every firm, but on average, it seems like the social norms are not binding enough for an average firm that that a subsidy can convince them to lean towards hiring a woman.
Do they advertise wages on the posting?
Yes, there is a salary band.
A band, okay. Because I was going to say the fact that fewer of them are expressing gender preference, I think is very encouraging, right? But then you don't, so that speaks to the social norms maybe not being as strong because now they're open to it. The second question would be, are they offering less money to women, right? So if they learned that, okay, we can hire them, and we don't mind it as much, but if they still pay them less because they feel they're less productive versus they're just paying them now that they've learned, after you subsidize, because you're not offering the subsidy when they're changing and being more open to hiring women, right? So they learned something. But if you can, it would be interesting if you could observe what they're actually paying the women without the subsidies, right? If they're paying them less. So that's why I was wondering if they give like a number, then you would almost have your answer, right? But if it's a range, then they could still be paying them less.
Yeah. We don't see that the range has changed. Like there are no effects on that, but we don't know what the actual wage is, and that's really hard to find out. But I agree with you. That's crucial, right?
And even just for kind of the curiosity of this, right? Like, could you look at if there are firms that do not post a band, that actually just post a number, and see if the number?
No, I think that the way that no, the format is that it's a band. Like I don't think any firm would ever say that it's one fixed number, right? Because it depends on the experience of the candidates and so on. So no.
Any other? Okay, if not, then I have one more. This is out of curiosity. These IT firms you talk about, kind of majority of them are IT. What kind of firms are we talking about? This is selling computers, or there are call centers kind of thing, or
call center? A lot of call centers and providing support. Yeah.
Call centers, but international kind of, or local call centers?
Both.
Okay, because the reason I was asking is that you said most of them are informal, where I would have thought that if it is international call centers, they will have some kind of a structure in place.
So the very few, if I don't know if you noticed, but there were a few firms that had 15,000 employees as well. They were of course formal. But I was talking about the average firm. The average firm is much smaller.
Even with 100 people, I mean, that's a big firm, right? I mean, for it to be informal, I don't know much about it.
But in Pakistan,
I don't know these things. Okay, and just for people to know, 58,000 is, what is it in dollars in the context?
$200 these days.
200. Probably more, slightly more than that, maybe something like.
Isn't it 300 rupees these
something
days?
like that. Yeah. And so
it's $200.
GDP per capita is about, what is it now? Is it $2,000 or something like that, or less than that?
PPP or nominal?
PPP.
So this is $200 nominal, right? So.
Right, nominal. Yeah.
But it's also like 2 years ago, right? So and there's been staggering inflation in the country, so you're probably looking at it slightly more now. So maybe, but these are like
relatively low paid jobs in a way, right?
But they're still well above the minimum wage in the country. So, I think PPP adjusted probably, I would imagine it's $600-700. So then it's not that bad.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay. If nothing else, then
thank you so much, everyone, for all the questions and for being here.